Jason had always laughed at ghost stories. As a seasoned hiker, he'd spent countless nights alone in the wilderness, listening to friends whisper around campfires about shadowy figures and vanished travelers. To him, it was all nonsense, just the wind playing tricks, or tired minds seeing what wasn't there. But Black Hollow Forest was different. Even the name sent a chill down his spine the first time he heard it. Locals in the nearest town, a crumbling little place called Elkwood, refused to talk about it. When he asked for directions at the gas station, the old man behind the counter had gone pale, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. "Ain't no one goes there after dark," he muttered. "Not if they want to come back." Jason had smirked, tossing his backpack into his truck. Superstition. That's all it was. The forest was just another patch of wilderness, and he'd spent years proving that fear was for people who didn't know how to survive. But as he drove deeper into the mountains, the sky grew darker, not from clouds but from the sheer density of the trees. Ancient pines with trunks so wide 3 men couldn't wrap their arms around them, their branches twisted together like skeletal fingers blocking out the sun. The GPS flickered, then died. He parked at the trailhead, staring at the narrow path ahead. No signs. No markers, just an unbroken line of trees swallowing the dirt whole. The air smelled wrong, not like pine and earth, but something stale, like old meat left to rot. He shook it off, probably a dead animal nearby. Shouldering his pack, he stepped into the forest. The silence was the first thing that unsettled him. No birds, no rustling leaves, just his own breath and the crunch of his boots on the ground. By midday, he found a clearing and set up camp, whistling to fill the quiet. The fire crackled to life as the sun dipped below the trees, painting the forest in long, grasping shadows. That's when he heard it, the first whisper. It wasn't the wind, it was a voice, faint, broken, like someone speaking through water. Jason froze, his hand hovering over his knife. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. A low, mournful chant, just on the edge of hearing. He spun, shining his flashlight into the trees. Nothing, just darkness swallowing the beam whole. "Get it together," he muttered, forcing a laugh, but his fingers trembled as he zipped up his tent. That night he dreamed of white eyes watching, him from the trees. The next morning, Jason woke with a start, his skin slick with cold sweat. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Then the thick, suffocating silence of Black Hollow rushed back, his breath fogged in the air, even though it wasn't that cold. The forest was too still. No birds, no wind. Just the oppressive weight of being watched. He unzipped his tent, half expecting to see something standing there, waiting. But there was only his campsite, the ashes of last night's fire, and the trees, so many trees, their gnarled roots twisting up from the earth like buried hands trying to claw free. He rubbed his face, trying to shake off the dream. Those eyes, those hollow, white eyes. Breakfast was a quiet affair. He chewed on dried meat, his ears straining for any sound beyond his own chewing. Nothing, not even the scurry of a squirrel. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Jason decided to explore deeper, telling himself he was just being paranoid. He marked his path with notches in the bark, though he knew better than to get lost. The deeper he went, the darker it got. The trees grew closer together, their branches weaving into a suffocating canopy that blocked out the sky. The air thickened, tasting of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood. Then he saw it. A structure, or what was left of one. A crumbling shack, its wood blackened with age, sagging under the weight of vines and moss. The door hung crooked, barely attached. Jason hesitated. This wasn't on any map. No one had mentioned a cabin in these woods. Curiosity warred with unease. He stepped closer, the ground squelching unnaturally under his boots. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the smell hitting him like a physical blow. Rotten meat, wet mold, and beneath it all, something sweet and cloying, like decay trying to disguise itself. Inside, the walls were covered in symbols, not graffiti, not random scratches, deliberate, jagged marks carved deep into the wood, forming patterns that made his head ache if he stared too long. And in the center of the room, on the floor, was a circle of stones. Inside it, the remains of a fire. Fresh. Not just fresh. Recent. The ashes were still warm. Jason's pulse thundered in his ears. He wasn't alone. Something moved outside, a slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the ground. Then, a whisper right behind him. Jason spun around, his breath catching in his throat, but there was nothing there. Just the empty doorway, the dim light filtering through the trees outside. The whisper had been so close, so real, like lips brushing against his ear. His skin prickled with goosebumps. The dragging sound came again. Thump, scrape, thump. Something was moving just beyond the shack. Something heavy. Something wrong. Jason's fingers tightened around his knife. He should run. Every instinct screamed at him to get out of that rotting cabin, to sprint back to his campsite, pack up, and leave Black Hollow forever. But his legs wouldn't move. Fear had rooted him in place. Then, a shadow passed by the broken window. Tall. Too tall and thin, unnaturally so, its limbs elongated, its silhouette warped like a reflection in dark water. Jason's stomach dropped. The thing outside stopped, moving. Silence. Then, a slow, wet inhale, like it was smelling him. His blood turned to ice. The door creaked. Something was pushing it open. The door groaned on its hinges, swinging inward inch by torturous inch. Jason's muscles finally unlocked. He stumbled back, knocking over a rusted tin can that clattered against the floor like a gunshot in the silence. The shadow in the doorway froze. Then it tilted its head. Jason's breath came in ragged gasps. Moonlight bled through the cracks in the walls, painting jagged stripes across the floor. One of those stripes cut across the thing in the doorway, illuminating just enough to make his mind recoil. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its limbs were too long, fingers dragging on the floor like knotted roots. Its skin, if it could be called skin, was a patchwork of peeling bark and something darker, glistening in the dim light like wet rot. But the worst part was its face, or lack of one. Where eyes should have been, there were only hollows. Deep, black pits that seemed to drink in the light. Its mouth was a ragged slit, stretched too wide, filled with shadows that moved like living things. Jason's knife felt useless in his hand. The thing took a step forward. The floorboards whimpered, under its weight. Another step. Jason's back hit the wall. Nowhere left to run. The creature's head jerked to the side in a motion that made bones click where bones shouldn't be. A sound leaked from its throat. Not a growl, not a hiss, but something between. A noise that slithered into Jason's ears and coiled around his spine. Then, a second whisper, this time from outside. Then a third, a fourth. They were answering it. The whispers outside multiplied, weaving together into a chorus of voices that didn't sound human. Not quite. Some were rasping, like dry leaves dragged over stone, while others were wet and guttural, as if the speakers were choking on their own tongues. Jason's heart hammered against his ribs so violently he feared it might crack bone. The thing in front of him had stopped moving, its head still cocked at that unnatural angle, but now its mouth was stretching wider, the shadows inside it writhing like maggots in spoiled meat. The stench in the cabin thickened, a suffocating mix of decaying wood and something far worse, the cloying sweetness of spoiled fruit left to ferment in the sun, undercut by the metallic tang of old blood. Outside, the dragging sounds grew louder, closer, and Jason realized with dawning horror that they weren't just footsteps. They were the sound of things being pulled behind them, heavy and limp, like sacks of meat. His mind flashed to the warnings from the gas station attendant, the way the man's knuckles had whitened around his coffee cup. Not if they want to come back. The creature in the doorway suddenly lunged forward, its elongated fingers snatching at the air where Jason's throat had been a second before. He barely dodged, rolling sideways as the thing's claws gouged deep furrows into the wall behind him, splinters exploding into the air. The force of the impact should have hurt it, should have at least made it recoil, but it didn't even flinch. Instead, it let out a sound that was almost a laugh, a gurgling, wet chuckle that made Jason's stomach twist. He scrambled backward, his boots slipping on something slick. Moss? No. The floor was covered in a thin, dark liquid that clung to his hands like tar. He didn't have time to process it. The thing was coming for him again, its movements jerky but impossibly fast, like a spider skittering across the surface of a nightmare. Jason's knife was still in his hand, but the blade looked pathetic now, a child's toy against whatever this was. He swung anyway, the steel flashing in the dim light as it connected with the creature's arm. The impact sent a jolt up his wrist, not the resistance of flesh, but something tougher, stringier, like cutting through wet rope. The thing didn't scream. It didn't even seem to notice. Instead, it grabbed his wrist, its fingers wrapping around his arm with a grip so cold it burned. Jason screamed as the numbness spread, his skin turning gray where the creature touched him, the veins beneath darkening like ink spreading in water. He wrenched himself free with a desperate jerk, stumbling back toward the doorway, but the thing was faster. It was always faster. The whispers outside had reached a fever pitch now, overlapping into a single, droning chant that vibrated in Jason's skull. He could see them now, shadows shifting between the trees, tall and emaciated. Their forms flickering in and out of existence like bad reception on an old TV. Some were crouched low to the ground, their backs hunched, while others stood unnaturally straight, their heads lolling to the side as if their necks had been broken long ago. And they were all moving toward the cabin. Toward him. Jason didn't think. He ran, bursting out of the shack. He barely registered the cold night air hitting his face, the way his lungs burned as he sprinted blindly into the trees. Branches lashed at his arms, drawing blood, but he didn't slow down. Behind him, the chanting grew louder, the dragging sounds keeping pace, always just a few steps behind. He didn't dare look back. He didn't need to. He could feel them, their breath on his neck, their fingers brushing against his jacket, always almost catching him but never quite closing the distance. It was a game to them. They were hurting him. And then, his foot caught on something. Jason hit the ground hard. His face slamming into the dirt, his vision exploding into stars. He rolled onto his back, gasping, just in time to see them emerge from the trees. Dozens of them. Hollow eyes, stretched mouths, and every single one was smiling. Jason's breath came in ragged, panicked heaves as he scrambled backward on his elbows, the damp earth soaking through his clothes, the cold seeping into his bones like an infection. The creatures didn't rush him. They didn't need to. They moved with a slow, deliberate certainty, their grotesque bodies swaying like reeds in a wind he couldn't feel, their hollow eyes fixed on him with a hunger that wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. The chanting had stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed against his eardrums, broken only by the occasional wet, clicking sound from their throats, like bones settling into place. One of them, taller than the others, its limbs twisted, like old roots, stepped forward, its tattered cloak of moss and bark rustling despite the absence of wind, and, as it leaned down, Jason caught a glimpse of its face up close for the first time. There were no features, not really, just those bottomless eye sockets and that terrible gaping maw. But as it drew nearer, he realized with a jolt of pure, mind-shattering horror that the darkness inside its mouth wasn't empty. Things moved. In there. Pale, wriggling things. Too many limbs, too many eyes, squirming over each other in a ceaseless, churning mass. The creature exhaled, and the smell that hit Jason was worse than anything he'd ever encountered. A putrid, cloying stench, of graves overturned and meat left to spoil in the sun, undercut by something sweet and nauseating, like rotting fruit. He gagged, his stomach convulsing, but before he could vomit, the thing's hand shot out, its fingers, too long, too many joints, closing around his throat. The cold returned, worse than before, spreading through his veins like liquid nitrogen, and suddenly he couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even blink. He was paralyzed, his body no longer his own, his mind screaming in a prison of flesh as the creature leaned in closer, its mouth stretching wider, impossibly wide, until all he could see was darkness, and the things writhing inside it. Then, a sound, a real sound, a gunshot. The creature's head snapped to the side, its grip loosening just enough for Jason to gasp in a lungful of air. Another shot rang out, and this time the thing recoiled, a black, tar-like substance oozing from its shoulder where the bullet had struck. The other creatures hissed, their heads swiveling toward the source of the noise, and Jason followed their gaze, his vision swimming, to see a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A man, older, his face lined with deep grooves of fear and determination, a rifle clutched in his shaking hands. "Run, boy!" the man shouted, his voice rough with terror. "Run, God damn it! Run!" Jason didn't need to be told twice. He lurched to his feet, his legs wobbling like a newborn deer's, and stumbled toward the man who fired another shot into the crowd of creatures, the bullet tearing through one of their ranks with a wet, splattering impact. For a moment, just a moment, Jason dared to hope. But then he saw the way the wounded creature reformed, its flesh knitting back together like ink spreading in water, and the man's face went pale. "Oh, God," the stranger whispered. There, not staying dead. Behind them, the forest erupted in motion. The creatures surged forward. And then, the screaming started. The old man's rifle barked again and again, each shot tearing through the night like a crack of thunder, but the creatures didn't stop, didn't even slow down. Jason watched in numb horror as black ichor sprayed from their wounds only to seep back into their bodies moments later, their flesh knitting together with a sickening wet sound like meat being pressed through a grinder. The stench of decay grew thicker, clinging to the back of Jason's throat, making every breath a struggle as he staggered toward the stranger, his legs still weak and uncooperative. The man grabbed his arm with a grip like iron, yanking him forward. With surprising strength for someone his age, his eyes wild with a fear that mirrored Jason's own. "Move, boy, move," he snarled, shoving Jason ahead of him as they crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at their faces, thorns tearing at their clothes like grasping fingers trying to slow them down. Behind them, the forest changed. The trees themselves seemed to twist, their trunks contorting into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands, and the shadows between them deepened, swallowing what little moonlight filtered through the canopy. The creatures didn't run. They glided, their movements too smooth, too fluid, their bodies flickering in and out of sight as if they were slipping between the cracks of reality itself. The old man risked a glance over his shoulder and let out a strangled curse, his face going ashen. "They're hurting us," he gasped, his voice raw with terror. "They're playing with us." Jason didn't understand, not until he saw the clearing ahead. It was his campsite, exactly as he'd left it. The tent still stood, the fire pit cold and empty, his backpack propped against a log as if waiting for him. But something was wrong. The air here was thicker, heavier, like wading through syrup, and the silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, nothing. It was as if they'd stepped into a photograph, a frozen moment in time. The old man skidded to a halt, his breath coming in, ragged, wheezing gasps, his eyes darting around the clearing with growing panic. "No," he whispered. "No, No, no. Jason turned. The creatures surrounded them. Not just the ones from before, dozens more emerging from the trees like nightmares given form, their hollow eyes fixed on the two men with a hunger that went beyond flesh. The tallest one, the one that had grabbed Jason, stepped forward, its mouth stretching into a grin that split its face in half, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that glistened with something dark and wet. The old man raised his rifle with shaking hands, but before he could fire, the creature moved. 1 second, it was 10 feet away. The next, it was right in front of him. The man didn't even have time to scream. The creature's hand plunged into his chest with a sound like tearing paper, and when it pulled back, it was holding something. Something beating. Jason didn't stay to see more. He ran. Blindly, desperately, with no thought but escape, he crashed through the trees, his vision blurring. With tears, his lungs burning, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. Behind him, he heard the creatures give chase, their laughter. God, they were laughing, echoing through the forest like the tolling of a funeral bell. And then he tripped. Fell. Rolled down an embankment, his body slamming against rocks and roots, until he came to a stop at the bottom, gasping, bleeding, his mind teetering on the edge of oblivion. When he looked up, he saw the road. The road. His truck was still there, just where he'd left it. The keys dangling from the ignition where he'd stupidly forgotten them. He didn't question it, didn't dare. He stumbled to his feet, his legs screaming in protest, and threw himself into the driver's seat, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn the key. The engine roared to life, and Jason didn't look back, not once, as he peeled out onto the road, the tires kicking up gravel, the forest receding in the rearview mirror. He didn't stop driving until the sun rose, until he was back in Elkwood, back among people, back where things made sense. But as he sat in the diner, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he couldn't bring himself to drink, he realized something. The creatures hadn't followed him. They hadn't needed to. Because as he reached into his pocket for his wallet, his fingers brushed against something cold and damp, a scrap of fabric, rotting, stained with something dark, and moving. Jason's fingers recoiled from the fabric as if burned, his coffee mug clattering to the diner floor in a burst of scalding liquid and ceramic shards. The waitress rushed over with a towel, her face creased with concern, but he barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to that single impossible scrap of cloth now lying on the cracked linoleum table. It was unmistakably a piece of his own sleeping bag, the same deep green nylon he'd zipped himself into just 2 nights ago, but now it was slick with something thick and black that pulsed faintly, as if breathing. The edges of the fabric twitched, curling inward like the legs of a dying insect, and for one heart-stopping moment, Jason swore he saw tiny, needle-like teeth glinting within the folds. Across from him, the old trucker in the next booth frowned, his grease-stained fingers pausing over his pancakes. "Kid?" he grunted, jerking his chin at the fabric. "The hell you got there?" Jason opened his mouth. To lie, to scream, he wasn't sure, but before he could speak, the fabric moved. It skittered sideways across the table, leaving a trail of inky ooze behind, and dropped to the floor with a wet plop. The waitress gasped, jumping back as the thing writhed, twisting itself into a knot before suddenly going still. The diner fell silent. Even the ever-present hum of the refrigerators seemed to pause. Then, with a sound like 100 bones snapping at once, the fabric unraveled. Except now it wasn't fabric at all. It was a hand, a small, withered child's hand, its fingers ending in jagged black nails, its skin the color of a week-old corpse. Someone screamed. Jason didn't wait to see what happened next. He bolted from the booth, shoving past the stunned patrons, his boots slipping in the spilled coffee as he crashed through the diner's door and into the blinding morning sun. His truck was still parked where he'd left it, but something was wrong. The driver's side window was rolled down. He knew he hadn't left it that way. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he approached, every instinct screaming at him to run. But where would he go? The thing in the diner had come from him. It had followed him out of Black Hollow. The truck's interior smelled like rotting leaves and wet earth. Jason's hands shook as he turned the key, the engine roaring to life with a sound that was somehow wrong. Deeper, harsher, like something growling. The rearview mirror showed nothing but an empty parking lot. But as he shifted into drive, a "ew" whisper brushed against his ear so close he could feel the damp chill of breath on his skin. "You left your bag." Jason's blood turned to ice. In the reflection, for just a fraction of a second, he saw them, crowded into the truck bed, their hollow eyes watching him, their mouths stretched in grins too wide for human faces. Then the mirror cracked. Spiderwebbing, from edge to edge, and the whispering began again, this time from inside the cab. The steering wheel vibrated under Jason's grip like a living thing, the truck's engine letting out a guttural growl that didn't sound mechanical at all. It sounded hungry. His knuckles turned white as he swerved onto the highway, the cracked rearview mirror reflecting nothing but darkness now, a swirling black void where the back seat should have been. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a single, hissing voice that slithered through the cab, dripping into his ears like poison. "You shouldn't have run." Jason's foot slammed down on the accelerator, the truck lurching forward with a scream of protesting metal. Trees blurred past the windows, their branches clawing at the glass as if trying to get in. He didn't know where he was going. Just away. Away from the diner, away from Black Hollow, away from the thing that had slithered out of his pocket and turned into a child's rotting hand. His breath came in ragged, panicked gasps, fogging the windshield. But when he reached to wipe it clear, his fingers met something cold and slimy. The glass was covered in moss, thick, pulsating tendrils of it spreading from the edges inward, their surface glistening with something that looked too much like saliva. Jason recoiled, his elbow hitting, the door lock with a dull click. The sound seemed to trigger something. The whispers stopped. For one heartbeat. 2. Then the passenger seat moved. The leather groaned as something invisible settled into it, the fabric indenting like a body leaning forward. The radio crackled to life, spewing static, and beneath the white noise, Jason heard it, the chant. The same one from the forest. The same one that had coiled around his campsite like smoke. His stomach twisted as the static resolved into a voice, low and rasping, speaking a single word. "Mine." The truck swerved violently, the wheel jerking in Jason's hands as if guided by another. He screamed, fighting for control, but the vehicle had a mind of its own now, tires screeching as it veered toward the shoulder. The trees here were different, older, taller, their trunks twisted into shapes that made Jason's eyes ache. He recognized them. Black Hollow. Somehow, he'd driven in a circle. The truck slammed to a stop, the engine cutting out with a final shuddering gasp. Silence. Then, a knock on the window. Jason turned his head slowly, his muscles locked in pure, primal terror. Outside, pressed against the glass, was a face. Pale, smiling, and wrong in ways his brain refused to process. The door locks clicked open. The moment the locks disengaged, the cab filled with the stench of wet earth and rotting meat, thick, choking, clinging to the back of Jason's throat like a physical presence. The smiling face outside the window didn't move, didn't blink, its hollow eyes boring into him with a weight that made his bones ache. Then, with a sound like cracking ice, its grin stretched wider, splitting at the corners until its cheeks tore open, revealing rows of needle-like teeth glistening with something dark and viscous. Jason's body moved before his mind could catch up. He threw himself across the cab, shoulders slamming into the passenger door as he tumbled out onto the road, gravel biting into his palms. The forest loomed around him, the trees swaying despite the absence of wind, their branches tangling, together into a suffocating canopy that blotted out the sky. His truck sat silent, its headlights flickering erratically, casting jagged shadows that slithered across the asphalt like living things. Then the headlights died. Darkness swallowed everything. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the sound of Jason's own panicked breathing, too loud, too fast, echoing in his ears like a drumbeat. Then, from the trees, something rustled. Not the gentle shift of the leaves, but the slow, deliberate sound of something dragging itself forward. Thump, scrape, thump. Jason scrambled backward, his back hitting the truck's grill. The dragging sound stopped. Silence. Then, a whisper, so close it brushed against his cheek. "You forgot your gift." Something cold and wet pressed into his hand. Jason looked down. The rotting child's hand from the diner was back, its fingers now twined around his own, its nails digging into his skin like hooks. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat as the hand squeezed, its grip impossibly strong, the bones beneath its decaying flesh grinding against his knuckles. Pain lanced up his arm, white-hot and searing, and suddenly he remembered. The campsite. The fire burning blue, the sleeping bag, something inside it. The hand yanked him forward with inhuman strength, sending him sprawling onto the road. Above him, the trees shuddered, their bark peeling away in long, wet strips to reveal glistening muscle beneath. The air hummed with a low, resonant frequency, vibrating through Jason's teeth, his ribs, his skull, as the shadows between the trees deepened, coalescing into shapes, tall, emaciated, their hollow eyes fixed on him. One stepped forward, then another, then dozens, their tattered cloaks of moss and bark rustling as they moved in unison, their mouths stretching open in unison, their voices merging into a single, deafening chant. "You left. You left. You left." Jason's vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in as the pain in his hand spread, his veins turning black beneath his skin. The child's hand fused to his own, its fingers twitching, becoming his fingers, the rot spreading up his wrist like ink in water. He tried to scream again, but his voice wasn't his own anymore. It was layered, distorted, as if something else was speaking through him. The creatures circled him, their chanting rising to a fever pitch, their bodies flickering like candle. Flames as the forest itself seemed to pulse around them, the ground softening, breathing, opening like a mouth beneath him. The last thing Jason saw before the earth swallowed him whole was his own reflection in the truck's shattered window. His eyes hollow, his smile too wide, his skin the color of old bark. Then, blackness. Jason awoke in absolute darkness, his body pressed against something damp and unyielding. Not dirt, not stone, but something organic, pulsing faintly around him like the walls of a living throat. The air was thick with the stench of decay, so heavy it coated his tongue, making each breath a struggle. He tried to move, but his limbs refused to obey, his muscles locked in place as if bound by invisible ropes. Panic surged through him, his mind clawing for any semblance of reason, but the memories came in fractured nightmare flashes. The truck, the hand, the chanting, the transformation. A faint, greenish light flickered to life above him, revealing the truth in slow, horrifying increments. He was underground, but not in a cave. The walls around him were ribbed, glistening with a slick, mucus-like film, their surface studded with what looked like half-digested bones, some human, some not. Roots dangled from the ceiling like veins, their tips dripping a thick black fluid that sizzled where it struck the ground. And beneath him, the floor moved, rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic undulation. This wasn't a place. It was a stomach. The forest had swallowed him. A sound cut through the silence, a wet, guttural clicking, like mandibles tapping together. Jason's head lolled to the side, his neck stiff as rusted hinges, and his breath hitched. They were here. Dozens of them. The creatures stood in a loose circle around him, their hollow eyes reflecting the eerie light, their bodies swaying in unison, to a rhythm only they could hear. At their center stood the tallest one, the one from the truck, its smile now stretched so wide its face had split vertically, peeling open like a flower made of meat. In its hands it held something. Jason's sleeping bag. Still zipped. Still. Full. The creature knelt beside him, its breath like a winter gale as it pressed the bag against his chest. The fabric squirmed against his skin, something inside it pushing outward, straining against the zipper. Jason's heart hammered, his pulse so loud it drowned out the chanting, the clicking, the breathing of the walls around him. The zipper began to slide open on its own, inch by tortuous inch, revealing a glimpse of what lay within. Rotting fabric, pale, twitching fingers, and a face. His face. But wrong, its features stretched, its eyes hollow, its mouth gaping in. A silent scream. The creature leaned closer, its lips brushing Jason's ear as it whispered a single word. Home. Then the thing inside the bag lunged, its arms wrapping around him in a grotesque embrace, its flesh melting into his like hot wax. Jason's scream was swallowed by the walls around him as the world dissolved into pain and darkness and the terrible crushing certainty that he would never leave Black Hollow. Not really, not completely, because something had always been in that bag, and now it was part of him. The pain was everywhere, inside his bones, behind his eyes, twisting through his organs like a nest of serpents burrowing deeper. Jason writhed as the thing from the sleeping bag merged with him, its rotting flesh dissolving into his skin, its memories flooding his mind in a torrent of images that shattered his sanity piece by piece. He saw the forest, not as it was now, but as it had been centuries ago, before the first settlers, before the name Black Hollow had ever been spoken. He saw the rituals, the sacrifices, the way the trees drank blood and whispered secrets to those foolish enough to listen. He saw the others, the ones who had come before him, the hikers, the hunters, the lost children, their bodies twisted into new shapes, their screams woven into the chanting that never stopped, not really, not even when the sun rose. And then he saw himself, not as he was now, but as he would be. A figure of bark and bone, his mouth stretched into a permanent scream, his hollow eyes reflecting the faces of those who would come after. A new guardian for Black Hollow. A new voice in the chant. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had never been the prey. He had always been the offering. The creatures around him stepped back, their heads tilting in unison as Jason's body began to change. His skin darkened, hardening into something resembling bark, his fingers elongating, his joints popping and reforming with sickening crunches. The pain reached a crescendo, and for one fleeting moment Jason's mind cleared, just enough to remember his name, his life, the person he had once been. Then it was gone, snuffed out like a candle. The forest exhaled, and Jason, or what had once been Jason, stood. His movements were jerky at first, unpracticed, but the creatures guided him, their clawed hands gentle now, almost reverent. They led him to the surface, where the trees parted to reveal the night sky, the moon a bloated yellow eye watching in silence. Below, in the clearing, a new campsite had been set up, a tent, a fire pit, and a sleeping bag, neatly unrolled, waiting. Jason understood. His lips peeled back in a smile too wide for a human face as he turned toward the trees, his hollow eyes scanning the darkness for movement, for curiosity, for the next lost soul who would hear the whispers and think, just the wind. The chant rose around him, his voice joining theirs, harmonizing with the rustling leaves, the creaking branches, the hungry earth. And deep in the forest, something stirred. A twig snapped, a flashlight beam cut through the trees, and Jason, no, the hollow thing that had been Jason, let out a soft, guttural laugh. The hunt was beginning again.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.